2020 and at least the first half of 2021 have been extremely rough years, and I don't think I need to point out the obvious as to why that was. With a highly infectious virus making its way around the world, a huge number of the planet's population were forced indoors, dissuaded from mixing with other people, and basically forced to put our lives on deep freeze for the foreseeable future. Aside from the key workers who kept society afloat, those of us who didn't have to go outside were forced to deal with a far simpler problem. Just how are we going to fill our time through the months to come? I could work from home, and I had a few books that I'd been planning to read for a while, but I also wanted a really involving game. Something that had a high skill ceiling, plenty of replayability, and most importantly of all, would keep me occupied for the long time I was probably going to be stuck like this. And the games I went with hit all three criteria out of the park without a single doubt. This is how Civilization saved my lockdown. Up until recently, I didn't really have much of a history with Sid Meier's Civilization series. I'd heard about Civ 5 before from uni friends, who would frequently make reference to how their games had gone on for what seemed like weeks, stretching long into the night in campaigns that would never actually end. To me, it seemed like getting into this series was akin to entering the big leagues of gaming. Most of the games I'd played up till this point were primary school levels in comparison, and Civ was this uber-complex leviathan for big-brained gamers only. Of course, I know now that there are myriad games with even more mind-meltingly complex mechanics out there. I could only imagine what younger me would have thought about Crusader Kings, for example. But I'd grown up mainly on console-based action games and platformers, as opposed to more heavily strategic PC games, so this perception of the Civ series really stuck with me. I had this vague notion that I'd get into the games sometime in the future, but for years after hearing about them, I kept feeling like it wasn't time yet. The thought of picking up something that was so complicated, so long-winded, and so hard to play was extremely daunting, and honestly, I didn't really want that at the time. Fast forward to March of last year. The UK was locking down in an attempt to mitigate COVID-19, and my friends and I were talking about how we'd spend our time. We threw around suggestions: Left 4 Dead, Payday, TF2, then that name came up again. Civ 5, the game I'd avoided playing for years. Now that my options for how to spend my free time were severely limited, it was almost like I didn't have an excuse anymore. I had leagues of time now, and no expectation on me to do anything other than stay inside and stay uninfected. So I did it. I got the Civ 5 base game on Steam and finally decided to see what all the fuss was about. Getting started wasn't exactly smooth sailing. Trapped on my own, on a small piece of land surrounded by fog, I had no idea what to expect and no real direction with which to guide my newfound nation. This was gonna be a rough ride. For those of you that aren't familiar with this series, they're turn-based strategy games in which the player takes on the role and persona of a historical leader, growing and ruling over their respective historical civilization. Every Civ game changes a little bit of the established formula, tweaking previous design elements, adding new ones and removing others, but generally the idea remains the same. Build your nation from scratch and raise it into the greatest civilization the world has ever known, or at least the greatest civilization in the current match. To do this, you found cities, build up your population, research new technologies, all manner of things to help your society grow and flourish. As you gain new citizens, you also have to keep them happy, developing luxury resources, positive social policies, and other amenities to make sure they don't revolt. Warfare is, as ever, an important element of the game, and keeping your army strong enough to ward off potential attackers is key to protecting the civilization you've worked so hard to build. All of this leads up to the game's obvious conclusion, victory, and there are multiple ways for you to win. Most strategy games I've played tend to have multiple win conditions, but they tend to involve either outright obliterating your enemy's forces or holding on to certain strategic points for long enough. Though Civ does let you win through dominating the whole world, it also has a variety of extra ways for you to come out on top. You can aim to complete the research tree and launch a rocket into space for a science victory, grow the arts and win with a culture victory, or prove yourself to be the world's nicest guy and win by diplomacy. Different games in the series have included extra win conditions too, meaning that the game isn't always about who can grow the biggest army and aggro their opponent to death. Not always, anyway. So you have to focus on managing your civilization, keeping research balanced against culture, making sure enemies don't invade but still putting time into giving your people entertainment, and all the while you're working towards the most feasible and effective win condition. As you do this, you also need to keep in mind your leader's abilities and special effects, making sure you're playing in a way that best takes advantage of them. You need to make sure you're developing the right tiles and using your workers in the most efficient way, as well as building settlers and sending them out to found new cities and expand your empire. Oh, and all of this costs money, so you're going to need a steady income flowing in, and be careful not to go in the red because that'll cost you science, and if you're going for a religion you need to develop that early and ward off any potential opposing religions establishing themselves in your cities, and make sure you're keeping track of the missions city-states have given you so you can get better bonuses with them, and building any potential world wonders to get their benefits before the opponent gets them, and now you're in a new era so your army's outdated, so you need to upgrade them, which costs money, but there's a policy card you can slot in to get a discount on upgrading troops, but you can't change policies until you research a new social policy, but you're still 3 turns away from researching your next social policy, so you could research an earlier social policy, but you really want to build the Statue of Liberty before Canada. And now Australia's declared war on you. Again.
War!
As you can imagine, it's a bit of a tricky game to get into. When I booted up Civ 5 for the first time, it felt like I'd emerged from a cave in which I'd lived my entire life, and, blinded by the light, could only grasp and paw at the first options available to me. Move a character? Okay, I can do that. Found a city? Okay, primitive instincts kicking in, I guess I should do that by a river. Now I can build something, so I guess I'll build a scout to look around. I can research too, so I guess I'll pick the best looking option available and just go with that. This was entirely how I played the game for the first probably 10 hours or so. I had a hint of what I should be trying to do throughout the whole game, but really I was just going by instinct and picking the options that made the most sense at the time, aka the most suboptimal decisions possible. But the more I played, the more familiar I became with the game's progression, and I started picking up on things like what technologies I would need later on, what social policies I could pick earlier to give my later game more consistency, what roles I could give each of my cities to make my empire more efficient, and pretty soon everything fell into place. It was like a revelation. One thing clicked after another, and pretty soon I found myself putting hours into the game. And, thanks to lockdown, I could feel completely morally sound for doing so. You could even say that by staying inside and playing Civ, I was gaming to save the nation. SeaWorld? Gamers are essential workers too. Okay, I probably shouldn't say that. The more I played, the more I found myself drawn back in. Every time I completed one of Civilization's long, drawn-out games, I would look back and think of times where I'd done something wrong. Like wasting turns on a pointless wonder when I could have been building up my nation in a more effective way, or neglecting to upgrade my army and tempting my neighbours to launch an impromptu invasion. I was never going to master one of the games after a playthrough or two. There are so many mechanics, and so many turn-by-turn optimizations for you to analyse and learn to pinpoint. Whenever I get into and enjoy a game, I always set myself a personal standard to reach before I can be satisfied that I officially know how to play the game. And for Civ, this took me months, even after putting over 1,000 hours into the series at this point. I'm not even sure I'm at that standard now. I always spot a new way to use my turns more effectively, or an error I'd made a few turns prior. It's not that I don't enjoy my game still, because I still love playing regardless of my mistakes. The mistakes just inspire me to keep playing and master my technique overall. I feel as though I've talked a lot about how hard it is to master the Civ style. Like there's only one way the game unfolds, and you just have to perfect that singular linear path. However, while there are certain principles that you need to become familiar with, it would be a little boring if all you had to do was run the same simulation over and over until you took the objectively right direction. Thankfully, there are a few methods Civ uses to shake things up. For one, every map in Civilization is randomly generated, giving you a new array of continents, luxury resources, and landmarks every time you start a new game. Each faction you choose usually has a start bias, meaning they will generally spawn near a certain terrain, but other than that, you can't usually predict what new environment you're going to start in whenever you boot up a game. This uncertainty is exciting and keeps the game fresh, encouraging players to adapt to new obstacles and build their cities in a way that best makes use of what they have around, exactly as the first settlers of these fledgling nations did in the real world. The real-life civilizations depicted in Civ also help lend a touch of variety to every game. Each civilization and leader has their own unique bonuses, buildings and units, with their abilities adapted from the roles these civilizations played in our world. As Spain, you're prompted to explore new lands, make discoveries on other continents, and settle colonies far away from home. As Brazil, you use the rainforest to your advantage and throw elaborate carnivals to spread your culture far and wide. Gaul predominantly settles their cities around mines, with encampments that shore up defense against any imperial assault. While it's true that there can be an ideal way to play each faction, there is sometimes room to move towards alternative, unexpected win conditions, and each player will have their own ideal way to play the game that's supported by at least one of the game's leaders, so people can figure out what they enjoy doing and form a playstyle based on it. Most of the factions are extremely well designed, and their abilities are so close in accuracy to their historical counterparts that it really does make you feel like you're the ruler of that nation. From what I've said so far, it might seem like the Civ series can get a bit convoluted, with so many values to keep track of, so much forward planning, and so many variables to modify your experience. And maybe it is a bit complicated, but this is exactly what makes every game so addictive, and why I relied on this game to stave off boredom during my country's 2 lockdowns. I never felt bored playing, as there were always bits I could improve on and new strategies to be figured out, and all of these strategies were open to be adjusted or replaced entirely based on whatever randomized monstrosity of a world the game decided to spawn, or whatever enemy civilizations were in the game with me. Every botched empire, every misplanned city only added to the replay value, giving me a little something to keep in mind for the next game, and the next game, and the next. Even though the world outside may have mostly stopped, and I couldn't really progress within it, Civilization still helped me feel that sense of development. I was exploring countless different virtual worlds that I could change and affect, building from nothing and eventually gaining mastery over a contained space that was all mine to develop. As my cities grew and prospered, I felt that sense of progression that I was missing, and a feeling that I was making an impact, even if it was only on this tiny simulacrum of Earth. But it wasn't the game alone that helped me through. As I said earlier, all of the historical leaders and nations featured in the Civ series have abilities taken from their actual history. As a result, when I found a faction I liked, I'd almost immediately look them up on Google, searching their name, their leader's name, the unique buildings and units they used, and so on. Finding out more about them reinvigorated my love for history, gave me inspiration for creative projects to do over lockdown, and reminded me of how different all our past societies have been. It made me feel like I was still someone living within the actual world and sharing it with all these different cultures, rather than just a person trapped in a room. It gave me that sense of escapism that during lockdown was just what I needed. It felt great to learn about the Maori or the Cree and just imagine this different world, so far away from the place I live, or so far away from the place I was currently confined to. Between the learning curve, the long-lasting gameplay, and the ample supply of factions to choose from, Civilizations 5 and 6 really helped carry me through what would otherwise have been an anxiety-inducing time. While they didn't make lockdown an absolute breeze, they definitely took a good amount of edge off the experience. In my country at the moment, there are no lockdown measures in place, though rumours are always flying around over whether the government will introduce at least some measures to weather the storm of a still high infection rate. So while I do play a little Civ 6 from time to time, it's nowhere near the amount I would play during my free time over last year. I just have other things to do now. I can go out and see people, take day trips to places, basically anything other than sitting at the computer. Because of this, my relationship with the games has changed. It's no longer the be-all and end-all of my spare time, and having played over 1,000 hours across Civ 5 and Civ 6, I've seen a lot of what I wanted to see. I've finished games with a lot of the leaders, gained nearly every type of victory, and even though I'm not the most skilled at the game, I have no real interest in developing my skills any further. Civ is a real time sink, even if you play the games on a faster setting, and I just don't feel the inclination to set aside most of the day going from cave dweller to astronaut anymore. That said, we're still not out of the woods when it comes to the pandemic. The virus is still around, and countries around the world are still facing in and out of various lockdown measures, even with vaccines stemming the tide as best they can. If your country decides to reinstate some form of lockdown, why not give Civ a look? There's always the chance it could help you, just as it helped me. Thanks for watching as usual. I hope you're all staying safe out there and finding a way to get through this. Especially the essential workers that help keep all of society running. You guys are the real MVPs, obviously. I thought it would be kind of morally wrong to do this video or a video about COVID without at least including a charity to donate to. So I'd suggest you guys take a look at Vaccinaid. They help deliver vaccines all over the world. And not only is that inherently a good thing, we're going to need everyone to be vaccinated and protected against this virus if we're going to see the end of it. So if you feel like contributing, the link is in the description. Other than that, I hope everyone stays well, and I'll see you next time.